Perfect. I think we can start now. So this is a session on energy security, the European case. Thanks a lot for having me. So I'm Bastien Contalou from Hydrogen Europe. And before we go into our discussion with the panelists I'll introduce, I will give an introductory presentation on this topic, and then we'll come to the panel discussion. So just let me introduce my association in a few words. So we are an industry and association at European level representing the hydrogen industry. So essentially, our members are companies, European or not. Most of them are European, but they have to have an industrial activity in Europe, and obviously have or be involved in some way or another with the hydrogen sector. So we have hydrogen producers of equipment all across the hydrogen value chain. Project leaders and managers from the production, transport, and distribution to the different end users of hydrogen, whether current users or future ones, such as the steel sector. And we're based in Brussels. And today's topic is energy security with a focus on Europe. I just wanted to come back to the essentials, and I've taken this definition from the International Energy Agency on energy security, which is summed up as the following: uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. Energy security has many aspects. Long-term energy security mainly deals with timely investments to supply energy in line with economic and environmental needs. And on the other hand, short-term energy security focuses on the ability of the energy system to react promptly to sudden changes in the supply-demand balance. So from that definition, I take two things. So first, that it is really about ensuring the continuous energy supply, production and delivery to meet the demand and at an affordable price. And also there is an interesting distinction between long-term and short-term needs and goals. And we can come back to that also in a discussion on how do we prioritize which measure for which objective. And based on this, there are essentially a bunch of different consequential challenges that we can derive. So one of them is, for instance, coping with limited fossil fuel supplies that we have on our planet, the transition to other sources of energy, such as renewables. But then there comes the question also of tackling the intermittency of the production from those renewable energy sources, the securing of supply chain, whether it is for the production of the equipment that will be necessary to produce renewables or other kind of energies, but also to transport them. One topic that we can also tackle in the panel debate when it comes to raw materials, for instance, that will be absolutely necessary for the clean transition. And also a very important point when it comes to the geopolitics of energy and trade is the diversification of partners and the improvement of energy independence or autonomy, depending on the political choice made by geographies there. And obviously there are many more challenges. But when it comes to the European case, I wanted to start with a few graphs to come back to the essential before we kickstart the discussion. So one important element, obviously, is what energy do we produce in the EU? So indeed, we produce some energy in the EU. Not all of it is imported. It is mostly about renewables. You can see the evolution of that red line. More and more renewables are being produced in the EU, and also obviously nuclear heat. So mainly renewables and nuclear. This amounts to about 24,000 petajoules out of circa 56,000 consumed. So this is not a majority. It is a big chunk, but this is not a majority that we produce in the EU. And then comes the question, which energy do we then import to the EU in order to satisfy the energy demand? Well, as you can see, this is really mainly oil and gas. So that's that gray, or the grayish green and purple line for natural gas, and then some other products such as naphtha, solid fossil fuels, or gasoline and diesel oil. And then where is that energy consumed? So here we're looking at final energy consumption by fuel in the EU, and it is primarily oil, obviously, and then gas and electricity. Interestingly, obviously, electricity is not found like this in nature, and is mostly produced in the EU from renewables, nuclear, but also from gas and coal, which are parts of that equation. And here, this is essentially the same graph, this time not per fuel type, but per end sector. So where is that energy consumed in the EU? And what we can take as a takeaway here is that there is a fairly balanced split across industry, transport, whether road transport and other modes of transport, and the heating for buildings, for households building. But what's most interesting for us in today's debate is where does the energy we consume in the EU come from? We partially answered that question with a previous graph, but here you can see that indeed a majority of the energy that we consume in the EU is obviously imported, and that a big share, about more than 1/3 of these imports, are imports from Russia. This country being the leading supplier of natural gas, coal, and oil to the EU. And obviously, considering the current situation, this is also a major challenge that the EU has to address in order to make sure that it has a safe energy supply. In that context, and following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the European Commission and the European Union at large published a strategy, which was first a communication and then a plan with detailed measure. And this plan is called REPowerEU. And the goal of this plan is essentially to swiftly phase out the dependency on Russian energy imports, primarily gas, but we've seen also coal and oil, by doing several things. First of all, saving energy, then diversifying energy sources, and then accelerating clean energy transition. And there are several possibilities and options, technological options, such as fostering of renewables production domestically, hydrogen production, the needs to store the produced power. Hydrogen can be a solution here also the deployment of heat pumps in buildings, etc., etc. A horizontal aspect, fourth one, is obviously horizontal to all of this, and this concerns smart investments to make all of this transition towards a more secure and cleaner energy supply possible. I just want to go into some details of this REPowerEU plan shortly. It is indeed about boosting more renewables, further than what current efforts have been trying to achieve. So the renewables energy target in the consumption out of the EU's final energy consumption was upgraded with this REPowerEU plan. And now the goal is to reach 45% of renewables and the energy mix of the EU by 2030. Obviously, from this derives a whole lot of other measures, such as boosting solar energy, permitting rules to deploy renewables faster, wind and solar primarily, but also doubling the heat pumps sales in 5 years. A big chunk of these policies also concerns the acceleration of the hydrogen sector. And the main target in that respect is the consumption of 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen by 2030. And here there are also sub-targets per sector, specifically looking at transport and industry. Many other measures are also of relevance that we can tackle further on in the discussion. REPowerEU also looks at stirring biomethane production, the development of a European hydrogen grid, but also the reduction of fossil fuel consumption in hard-to-abate sectors with different funding schemes, such as carbon contracts for difference, or using emissions trading system revenues, so the EU ETS revenues, to help the fostering of clean technologies. Other aspects obviously concern achieving that infrastructure, so both in gas, but also in the power grid and storage. Here, many funds across the EU are helpful to fund that effort. There is also the post-COVID crisis funds that are also playing a major role to achieve REPowerEU objectives. So that's the recovery and resilience plans that came after the COVID crisis. So here, money from that pot is also being used to achieve those REPowerEU objectives. And this is a map that we as Hydrogen Europe derived from exactly what is written in the in an energy strategy of the EU, published within REPowerEU plan. So this is how the European Commission foresees the diversification of energy partners around the globe, specifically looking at hydrogen. We indeed foresee big production of hydrogen on European territory, but also abroad. And this is a mapping of the countries that you can see that could play a role, but not only for hydrogen, but also for liquid natural gas, LNG, also for gas via pipelines. So here you can see countries such as Canada or the US playing a main role for LNG, but also hydrogen, especially for Canada, for instance. Obviously, this could very well develop also for the US. For hydrogen, also main partners could be North Africa, such as Algeria and Morocco, and Ukraine also when we can reach a solid reconstruction phase. One more word on hydrogen. So we foresee the role of hydrogen to be quite encompassing all across the energy sector. So today it plays mainly a role as a feedstock, but it could very well play a role also for heating purposes, industrial processes in steel, for instance, and also increasing the systems integration, especially in a context where you will have more and more renewables energy. It could also play a main role in transportation, especially long haul and heavy duty transportation. And essentially all of this also feeds into an energy security strategy, and hence its major role to play in the REPowerEU plan. And here that's what's squared and red, to secure the safe and clean energy supply for the EU by also providing jobs on EU ground. And here, this is to give you an idea of what the industry is planning on doing. So these are just to give an idea in terms of numbers on plans of projects that are out there, different stages of achievements, most of them being still in preparatory stage or feasibility study. But this is to give you an idea that if all those projects that we track that have been announced by industry on European ground would be sufficient to meet the REPowerEU production targets. As you can see, this line being reached by 2030, but all of this depends a lot on topics that we'll address, on what kind of measures should be put in place to actually stir the hydrogen sector, but also the renewable sector, securing safe value chains for the supply of raw materials, etc., etc. We are still indeed in a context where many parts of the regulatory framework in the EU is still to be defined. When we see hydrogen, we've come from a European hydrogen strategy in 2020 to a so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a regulatory package. So essentially European laws, directives or regulations that are being either reviewed, so updated with more ambition, or new proposals. And then third step being the REPowerEU strategy that I mentioned, which updates further that Fit for 55 package in the context of the needs to phase out the Russian dependency. So this is the three steps that we've seen in the evolution of the measures that are being proposed to stir the hydrogen sector. But for many other sectors, this is actually a similar one, because REPowerEU doesn't look only at the hydrogen sector as mentioned, but also at renewables and further. I will skip this slide for the sake of time and actually come directly to a set of outstanding questions that we have. There are very many, obviously. The question as to whether this plan is actually sufficient to cope with this winter for the supply of natural gas, for instance. And the next one, is the industry ready, and is the regulatory framework fit for this transition in the sufficient speed? What's the role for energy savings? Are member states on board? And how energy geopolitics will be defined or redefined? These are questions that we want to tackle with our panelists that I'd like to introduce to you now. So let me now welcome the four panelists that we have today to talk about the energy security European case. First of all, I'd like to introduce Victoria Judd. Victoria is a multi-specialist financing lawyer who advises borrowers and financial institutions on a broad range of transactions with a focus on energy finance and project development. She works at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman LLP, which is an international law firm with a particular focus on the technology and life sciences, energy, financial and real estate and construction sectors. She holds a master's in philosophy at the University of Cambridge and a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology at Imperial College, London. I'd then like to introduce to you Jeffrey. Jeffrey Bayer is the Managing Director at Zest Associates, which is a UAE-based sustainability consultancy focused on business and government strategy, clean tech innovation, and green finance. He specializes in forming new programs and initiatives to accelerate solutions like hydrogen, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable food systems. Jeffrey has launched innovation programs for utilities and multilateral banks, established national clean tech centers of excellence, and delivered projects in 20 countries. And he holds an undergrad degree in economics and psychology and a master's of environmental change and management at the University of Oxford. I can see our last panelist, so we will stick to our current panel. So again, Victoria and Jeffrey, thanks a lot for having joined me on this panel. And I'd like to kickstart with a question to you, Victoria, on the REPowerEU plan. Can you tell us if the REPowerEU plan, which was the EU's main reaction when it comes to energy policy after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, is up to the challenge that it pursues, up to the objective that it pursues, especially in terms of funding? We've seen that some funding were redirected from a previous spot. Will this be enough for the EU to reach its ambitions in terms of energy security?
I mean, I'd rather start with the views of other people, and then I'll give you mine. So in terms of, it sort of depends where you're coming from. If you're Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace, then most obviously this is not fit for purpose. It doesn't. It's a transitional proposal plan that will get us to the energy, to transition away from the Russian issue of having too much supply from Russia. It might majoritarily tries to get people onto more natural gas from other sources and potentially using a little bit more hydrogen than we had previously planned in the Fit for 55 package. It doesn't, it doesn't address the issue of how do we do more renewables in Europe immediately, because the immediate issue is basically we're going to have to import from elsewhere. If you look at, say, the energy in general, then yes, it's a good plan. There's more investment going into energy. This is great. We like investment. We like anything that encourages money coming into our sector. This is a good thing. So they generally, view it as a good thing. If you look at renewables, the renewable in this industry are looking at this and saying, well, are we just moving addiction to something else? We're going from having addiction to oil and gas from Russia to having an addiction to, perhaps just natural gas as a transition, maybe LNG as an alternative, and potentially, then we're moving on to hydrogen, which is its own issue in terms of, the way I see it, Germany exports fantastic electrolyzers down to the Middle East. The Middle East then imports a whole lot of, sells its imports to Germany, and Germany is now dependent on another source for hydrogen. I mean, you can take the model and apply it to different countries, but that's just one example. So, what's my view in this? My view is that it's a government policy. It's a plan. You need a plan. Everyone has to start with a plan. The fantastic part of what I see in government policies and plans is that for the most part, they're actually quite well researched plans, which means that governments don't put forward plans without having actually tested that industrial players can bring them forward. But this is the part where my role as a lawyer, putting things in place, actually comes in. It's one thing to have a plan, be it reasonably ambitious, but then there's actually carrying out the plan. So where we are at the moment is that the Fit for 55 measures are intended to become legislation later in this quarter, as are the new plans under this policy. So we're not yet at a point where we actually have any legislation. We still just have a plan. So we've got legislative risk putting this in place. Then we've got construction risk. Then we've got counterparty risk of who are these people going to put this in place. And we have the sort of actual every member state has to play its role into how to put this in place, has to actually activate it, find their ways to implement it. And so all of these aspects that go into planning, as well planned as they may be, there are just a lot of issues that could creep up and could happen. I mean, I'll give one example. We talk about hydrogen as one of the great alternatives, but hydrogen is not quite yet there yet. And if you talk to industry about a year ago, everyone was pricing, seeing hydrogen as an attractive alternative with price. These days, no one's really looking at a price for hydrogen. It's no longer center of mind. So this is when you say, okay, we have a plan on one hand, and on the other hand, we have what the market is saying, and it's a little bit more difficult. So I think my view is, and this is a typical lawyer answer, time will tell. It's ambitious, perhaps not ambitious enough. I'd like to see more, but really the truth is in the making of the cake. That's not a mixed metaphors. The truth will be in how we, in the pudding, when we actually unveil it and see the result.
Thanks all for that, Victoria, and perhaps compliment on what's been said earlier in the presentation. That Fit for 55 massive package, which is the future EU's energy and climate policy, so far is just a proposal. Some texts are starting just now to be finalized, so compromises being reached by the several EU institutions that are playing a role, but most of them haven't been finalized yet and been approved. So it is indeed still a plan. And I mean, speaking for the hydrogen sector now, this is indeed a major challenge for the industry also to make its business case. And here comes the question of the price too, because when you don't have that regulatory framework clarity yet, it is very hard for any business, for any project developers to have its clear business case. That's the case, for instance, for the definition of what is renewable hydrogen, for instance. We still don't have one today, whereas on the other side, we speak a lot of its potential. So a lot of things still needs to be clarified in the regulatory framework, for sure. Perhaps a question for you, Jeffrey. So I was wondering, before any full decarbonization is achieved, what should policymakers prioritize to ensure energy security? We've seen that in that definition that the IEA gives on energy security, there is a clear distinction on short-term and long-term. So how do you conjugate the fast decarbonization on the one hand and the remaining need to keep supplying still significant amount of fossil fuels, for instance, to heat homes this winter? Is it easy to prioritize this kind of dilemma, and how can you do it as a policymaker?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bastian. I think, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join this great panel. Listen, I think prioritization is always a challenge, and I think especially in the European Union, there are so many different competing interests and competing kind of economic makeups that agreeing at a European level on a single priority is sometimes challenging. I think the one area that no one can argue with is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a no-brainer, right? It saves money right away. It reduces dependence on imports. It reduces demand growth. It makes renewable energy targets easier to hit because overall demand can reduce. And I think that there's a massive scope for improved energy efficiency across the European Union. This is something I know that the International Energy Agency is fully behind. And I think the challenge there is around making it work. So energy efficiency makes all kinds of theoretical sense. And then when you try and implement energy efficiency, it encounters all of these different barriers. So people don't care. It's not a sexy topic, right? Like it's often a smaller component of your overall bill if you're a commercial or residential player. I mean, not so much nowadays when energy costs are so high and people are frantically looking to reduce their consumption. But in general and historically, energy has been a relatively small component of an overall bill. There's all these very familiar barriers to energy efficiency. I think actually one thing that really helps to overcome those barriers, a very elegant solution, is looking at the energy service company market. It's called ESCOs. ESCOs are an incredibly elegant solution to many of the barriers that are faced by energy efficiency. essentially, you can look into an ESCO model for those on the call that aren't familiar with it, but essentially an expert energy efficiency company kind of takes on the energy bill of a client in exchange for being able to control the energy that the client uses. It installs new equipment to achieve an energy savings and splits some of the savings between itself for income and profit revenue and for the client or building owner. Super elegant model. The ESCO takes care of financing. Their energy efficiency experts. The client doesn't have to think about it. ESCOs themselves face barriers, but those can be overcome with government entities, so-called super ESCOs. So that's a lot about energy efficiency. That's, I think, the easy priority. Beyond that, I think the other priority is really around it's a regulatory one, and really loosening the constraints to regulation that many countries face, especially around solar PV development. Solar is really easy to install. It can be just like, plugged into a field. It's the most basic kind of solution that's out there. The challenge around mass deployment for solar is the fact that you need a lot of permits, a lot of permitting to install solar panels. I think that there's a real opportunity here to, use existing just green fields, brown fields, anywhere. You can just kind of stay. It's almost like setting up a big circus tent. That's essentially what solar panels are. It's like you peg some things into a ground, you hook up some wires, you feed it into the grid, and that's a solar farm. It's of course more complicated than that, but essentially that's what you're looking for. So I think the big constraint there is regulatory hurdles, and those can be overcome by just freeing it up. And later, if there's complaints, you can always unhook your solar and move it somewhere else. That's when you're dealing with real wartime energy security issues, like I think Europe fears now that Russia's cut the gas. That's one option. I think those two are the things I'd focus on first: energy security through improved energy efficiency, and then removing regulations for new solar.
Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. So that's clear: energy efficiency and permitting rules, which are being tackled in the REPowerEU legislation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of the first time that is so high on the agenda. We've had for the first time compulsory measures that are still being to be approved, but on a compulsory reduction of energy consumption, not least gas consumption. And this is also a first. So it is, I think, being increasingly taken seriously as a way to provide for a safe energy supply. So you've answered my question on energy savings. So thanks a lot for that. I'd be interested to hear from you, perhaps from the both of you, on what member states behind the EU are doing themselves. If you have cases of country that have really set out plans that are ambitious to fulfill these goals in terms of accelerating permitting rules, accelerating the hydrogen industry, deploying heat pumps, renovations. Are they behind? Are member states behind that EU strategy of REPowerEU? We know that there are big differences across member states in terms of culture, politics, history, etc. Some of them are facing a needed transition from polluting industries to cleaner ones, more than other member states. So how are member states coping with this context?
Well, look, everyone's doing something different, and I think what's probably interesting is seeing which bits are sort of coming out of governments at the moment in terms of their announcements. So I think beginning of October, you just had all the sort of announcements on what everyone was doing on energy sobriety, and in terms of everything else, I think they're still sort of trying to figure out exactly what their policies are. I mean, we've seen. It's not in the EU anymore, but we've seen the UK answer to REPowerEU has come out, and that frankly is more of a cooperation statement of we're going to do much the same, and we're working in the same direction. We've seen the US sort of provide joint statements to the EU Parliament as well, saying they're on board and they'll do everything to help this energy security issue and the crisis and moving it forward. In terms of real plans, they're not really that updated from what they were previously. So, whether it's, funding towards heat pumps. That funding was generally in place in most countries that were trying to push them prior to REPowerEU. And so, that funding is not really changing at this point in response to the EU legislation. Coming back to your point, it really isn't in legislation yet. So people are thinking about how they rework their strategies. So I've been working a lot with Portugal, for instance, trying to imagine how to do their offshore floating wind on top of their hydrogen. And so it's actually, what's interesting there is to see how much their own strategy is evolving in line with the EU one. So the EU first came out, as you pointed out on your slides, with the hydrogen strategy. And so everyone got on board with hydrogen. So we had a client who was interested in offshore floating wind. So we sort of said, what can we do with offshore floating wind? This is renewable. Can we not get in there and do something? And at the time they were like, no, the EU instructions are, we're doing, everything's about hydrogen. This is what we're doing now. Move on a couple of years and you've got the Fit for 55. Well, now Portugal's strategy is, the EU says we can do other things. There might be some funding for other renewables. Let's have a conversation. And I think it was earlier this summer, just before the energy minister changed in Portugal, they announced that, we're going to have an offshore floating wind round. And so you're sort of seeing things come through, but it sort of takes a while. And as any energy project of a large size, and bar Jeffries, plug them in and go solar panels, everything takes a little bit of time to build up. So you've got your permitting issues, whether it's 1 year or 2 years to actually get things through. Then you've got actually getting funding for the projects and getting all the consortia together with the suppliers of the natural the raw materials, the suppliers of the industrial materials, the actually grid connections. All of these things have to be developed for the renewable power grid as much as just for bringing in new electricity. And so they're just not there yet. So I love the idea that European countries are responding to this, but I think what we're starting to see is a slow response to different areas and different pillars in the EU, in the REPowerEU, but we're not there yet to a sort of a full response. On the plus side, as you illustrated, Fit for 55 versus REPowerEU, slightly more ambitious targets, a few more things entered in there that might sort of help move things forward, but not dramatically different. And so actually the hope is probably that, well, maybe there won't be so much change to what's already, going in the right direction, and that we will eventually get there. But I'd say it's too early yet to see individual countries having entirely revamped their strategies to work with REPowerEU.
Thanks a lot for that, Victoria. Indeed, so you've taken the example of Portugal. This is an interesting case where maybe it is waiting a bit for the EU's push and in terms to guidance on which strategy to take with regards to wind power, but also hydrogen, and indeed REPowerEU also rests on the Fit for 55 package. That's for sure. It is providing an update, a bit more of an ambitious update than what was out there. There are a few new proposals, but most of it indeed rests on that proposal from now already July 2021. So that's for sure. I see that Amr Ghaffar joined us. Welcome, Amr. I just want to take a few seconds to welcome you on our panel and introduce you, if I may, to the audience. So,
apologies.
No worries at all. No worries at all. Pleasure to have you. So I'll just say a few words. So you are a director of Manchester Fuel Cell Innovation Centre and a sustainability professional with more than 17 years experience in the sector. You're a passionate advocate for fuel cell and hydrogen technology, and you've successfully built consensus and momentum in Manchester and in the Northwest region towards positive environmental practice and cleaner energy over the last decade. You've also funded the Greater Manchester Hydrogen Partnership to develop and support hydrogen technology projects in the city of Manchester. So thanks a lot for joining us. Maybe you want to hop on that last question of maybe seeing EU member states behind the strategy of the EU, or even perhaps within the UK, which is now not an EU member state anymore, but how are local communities, authorities behind a national strategy, for instance, a national strategy of the UK on hydrogen? If you can say a few words on that, how do these different levels communicate with each other and are consistent with each other?
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Anita. It's a pleasure to be here, and apologies for being late. Technical problems within the university itself. So if you take, the UK National Hydrogen Strategy, it's trying to, is it there where the sector needs it to be? And the answer is probably not, because what it really requires is a national program to underpin the strategy, which doesn't exist. And I think the strategy has a pathway for many different organizations to get involved with the hydrogen opportunity. The challenge of it all is do we have, and I think what Vittoria was saying before is spot on, is do we have all of the components ready today to deliver on a hydrogen economy? Clearly not. And I think we don't have enough manufacturers developing this type of technology, so we need more and more organizations to get involved. So if you quantify all of the different global hydrogen roadmaps that are in existence today to the level of delivery that they want by 2030, you will realize that the manufacturing capacity, it just isn't there. You need more manufacturers developing this kind of technology. You need the more of the regulatory frameworks developed. You need the standards, the measurement, testing, all of that needs to be done, and it needs to be done quite quickly. So if you take the differences in national programs as an example, then, so the UK National Strategy has a program is trying to develop a program. What that has is certain mechanism which is allowing the industry to develop projects. So it is now just finished a round for contracts for difference, because the consumer wants to pay relatively similar sort of price for hydrogen as it does for gas. So what that contracts for difference price is going to do is allow certain developers to offer a similar sort of price for hydrogen as the consumer is paying for gas. But in other parts of the world, the R&D programs or the deployment of technology is the main focus. So that contract for difference price isn't there. So what we've done here in Greater Manchester as an example, we've focused on what role is hydrogen going to play within our ambitions to be a net zero region. We have a very ambitious target of achieving net zero by 2038. It's a science-based target, but what was never done at the start of that science-based target being developed was the cost implication of developing that target. So to deliver, this is quite some recent work that has been done to deliver on a target, with the ambition of achieving net zero by 2038, it's going to cost somewhere in the region of £64.3 billion. Now, 7 or 8 billion of that needs to be delivered in the next couple of years. Some of this is obviously business as usual costs, but then it's recognizing that a city region like Greater Manchester has its biggest challenges in transport and domestic gas. So how do we decarbonize those sectors? Well, within technology like hydrogen, we're trying to find its role, and we think its role is in, at the moment, heavy transportation through to heat network opportunity, or looking at hydrogen production, where we can use curtailed wind to run hydrogen projects. Now, curtailment in the UK is a perfect policy mechanism which could be used to develop more and more hydrogen projects. That currently costs the UK taxpayer around £500 million a year. So that's where, the wind turbines are stood still, but the subsidies still have to be paid. That's an ideal time to run hydrogen projects. We're now in a position where organizations are finally able to make an investment decision on hydrogen, because 3 weeks ago, we had planning permission approved for the UK's largest electrolyser project in Greater Manchester. That is a 200 megawatt electrolyser project, which is going to be built in phases. Phase 1 will be delivered by Q1 2025, which will be 10 megawatts. That already has aggregated demand from a number of different off-takers who will take the hydrogen once it's being generated. That provides multiple use cases for that hydrogen across transport and heat networks across the city region. So what we've really done in that last 10-year period is we've built an innovation centre which is building a supply chain. One of the things that I think not many people mention is it's not just about the technical solution that we're trying to solve with hydrogen. It's not about the technology, it's about the skills problem as well. How are we going to resource all of these different projects? So it's not just about what we want from government, it's about how do we want the sector to respond. So what are the types of courses that will kind of attract, electrolyzer manufacturers? Do we need more electrical engineers working on different forms of electrification? Do we need more people to have that understanding of what net zero actually means? Because that is affecting investment decisions. the core of the biggest problem, we're talking about an energy crisis. One of the UK's biggest problems is the fact that we don't store much energy. We need to store a lot more energy, and hydrogen provides that opportunity. And if we do this correctly, I think it allows us, alongside the infrastructure, to build up the required skill sets that are going to be needed for, a range of disciplines. And at the core of all of those disciplines, it's about looking at this as a multidisciplinary approach. So you need financial experts, you need more project managers to interoperate how these kinds of technologies will work with existing assets. We built our lab in Manchester in 2018. It took 18 months of planning approvals just because we got stopped a number of times by the health and safety executive or Desir, because we were doing something that was different and had not been done before within a region like Greater Manchester. And I think what we're hoping is, as that learning progresses, we need to ensure that we're actually developing this as an economy, as opposed to saying that this is just about constructing a number of different hydrogen projects, because that bit's the easy part.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Amar. And then indeed, so when it comes to the hydrogen sector, there are a lot of ambitions now, both from the industry and from governments. But now we need to go up the supply chain also and see where do we get these materials from that we will need to deploy the hydrogen sector and the hydrogen projects. Hydrogen's future is mostly based on electrolysis technology. Some other technologies will also play a role. But when you look at electrolysis, you need electrolyzers and you need renewables or clean power. So we need to build all that clean power, so be it renewables or nuclear, and then you need all the necessary materials to build those clean power plants. Some of them we'll see are not actually to be found in the European territory, and also you need to have the materials to build the electrolyzers. So it's a very tricky question, and that leads me to the question actually of raw material security. So how can the EU ensure, beyond purely energy security, but how can it ensure that it has a safe raw material supply security that will be needed for beyond hydrogen, solar PVs, electric vehicles, etc. And that's a major challenge. I wonder if Jeffrey, you could maybe say a few words on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Listen, I've encountered this perspective a lot in the last few months, actually, since the Russian war began, and it's this perspective that trade leaves one exposed to risk, and that needs to be minimized or even eliminated. And so it follows that an atomization of the world from energy or from raw materials or anything else is the best solution. And is kind of a pendulum swing away from the heavily integrated globalized world that I think emerged in the 90s and early 2000s. So there is this refrain that I'm hearing a lot, that we need to basically insulate ourselves from potential trade partners that we think may in future turn out to be unreliable. And my personal perspective is that that's not efficient, first of all, and it's also just not a good thing. I think that trade is a good thing. And we'll start on the efficiency perspective. Listen, Europe is geographically not a very big place, but it's a very hungry energy consumer, right? The Netherlands is a tiny country with 17 million people. It's not going to be energy independent ever. That's not realistic unless it builds a bunch of nuclear plants, which I don't think it's going to do. So should the Netherlands worry about its exposure? Should it rely only on European or democratic partners for its energy trade? I mean, it could, but that sacrifices, I think, some of the efficiency that you get from importing energy from places that are good at producing energy. Like, I'm in the Middle East right now. I mean, there's a reason that people trade with the Middle East. They've got lots of oil, it's cheap. In the future, they've got lots of renewables, and they're also cheap, and they can be transported in different ways. Trade isn't a bad thing. And I think the exposure that Europe has had to Russian gas, we saw the slide earlier, right? It was 24%, I think, of Europe's energy need was being met by a single trade partner. Like that's bad decision. That's bad policy making. And that was something that I think was done in the past to be able to try and integrate economically, historically unreliable partner, because the thought was that the more you integrate Russia economically, the less chance there is of it going rogue and doing something like it's done, because the consequences economically would be so huge. Now, listen, it hasn't turned out that way. We've got a more disruptive partner than we were hoping for. But does that mean that trade with Russia in the future, or trade with the likes of China or the Middle East or other places that some people feel are less reliable is a bad thing? No, I don't think so. And it also gives the importing countries an economic tool, a lever to try and ensure that rules-based systems are followed, that good behavior happens internationally. So, are we exposed to lithium and cobalt and precious metals from the Congo and other places? Absolutely. Does that mean we should never trade with these partners and try and insulate ourselves? I don't really think so. So that's my first response in terms of the efficiency of this whole point of trade, and also whether or not trade's a good thing. I think we want to look at one more thing as well, and this relates actually to what you just said, Almer, around storage. Energy storage is a big issue, especially when you're dealing with renewable powered systems, and it's something that is absolutely critical for all time periods. I know, Bastien, you mentioned look at the short term and the long term for energy security. And I think when you're dealing with electricity in particular, the short term, you can think really short and think about like grid stability. So second to second, balancing of power, ensuring the frequency of the system is up to snuff. Medium term, we can look even at day-to-day fluctuations between the daytime when the sun shines, the nighttime when the wind is often stronger, and can that be balanced so you get a stable grid? And then, long-term storage, I would argue, is seasonal, interseasonal storage. So there are many different types of storage I think that we need to look at to ensure energy security. I think that we really need to develop the storage sector. And I think another solution to that is also increasing interconnection between countries. This is basically building high voltage cables between different grids. Europe is quite interconnected already. The UK has connections to Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. I think the more interconnection, the better for energy resilience. And you also get much cheaper prices if you're able to trade power across borders and manage unexpected changes, like half of France's nuclear fleet being out of commission this summer. So I think that you get that kind of benefit as well. I'll stop there, but that's just my reflections on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Very interesting. I think the takes that I have from that is the key to have diversified portfolio of partners, of energy partners. So it's not wrong to trade, but you need to trade with reliable partners and a good amount of partners so that you can diversify and loosen or reduce the risks. Then the question of energy storage, how to store energy, especially in the context where you have intermittent renewables. And also connecting the different member states, at least in the EU context. And I would add to that also the circularity topic, which is also key in the context of keeping the raw materials that we import from outside of the EU and keeping them in the EU as much as possible to reuse them, to recover them. And that also, I think, we'll agree can play a role in fostering our security of supply for those raw materials, and in the end for our energy security. And this is also an interesting topic for, I'm sure, very many research and innovation centers. So Amer, if you want to add to that, also you're welcome to do so. But I see that we only have just little time. So Amer, if you want to say a few words on this to complement, and then I'd be curious to just hear your thoughts on maybe the different challenges that the US and the EU are facing, also in the context of energy security, because the EU produces or is able to exploit less energy from its ground than the US is, but it consumes also less energy per capita than Americans do. So how are those challenges applicable to those two geographies?
Yeah, just very briefly on the scenario of recycling materials. I think you're absolutely right. It has to be a circular position here, because otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, you look at most of the technology we're talking about, whether it's battery, fuel cells, or electrolyzers. Well, battery, it's lithium. With fuel cells, it's platinum. With electrolyzers, it's iridium, which is a byproduct of platinum, and it's 10 times more expensive than platinum. And there's certain parts of the world where this effectively comes from. So I would say the key thing for researchers is to explore how you recycle these better, or exploring alternative materials to these. So we in Manchester like the word graphene quite a lot. So we're exploring the use of graphene in various different technologies. It's still very expensive, and that's what needs to come down. The cost of it needs to come down, and exploring various different 2D materials. So I think the exploring of new materials is a challenge for researchers all over the world. Exploring the circularity of any system like this has to be a necessity. And I think making sure that everything, I think as Jeffrey mentioned, I think the interconnecting piece, because even interconnecting a UK network as an example is tough. So no one will make, I'll bring it back to that point about the investment decision. No one will make an investment decision on hydrogen technology unless they can see an interconnected network across the UK, never mind the EU. So this is, and I don't mean that never mind the EU because we left the EU. I just mean never mind the EU because we're trying to solve, the UK's problem of trying to achieve net zero in various different regions, and no one will make that investment decision because they will only do it on projects that affect, locally. But a freight manufacturer will not do it until that interconnected network exists across a country like UK. So that was the only thing I'd sort of add to that.
Thanks, Amber. That's clear. Thanks a lot. We are a bit over time. Maybe Victoria, if you just want to say add on that to conclude before we end the session on the circularity aspects and on different challenges vis-a-vis the EU and the US before.
Yeah, sure. Probably the one thing, obviously, I assume most of I've seen that people are dialed in from all sorts of places, but I assume there is a large number in the US. So bringing it back to the US and the European question, these days the world is interconnected. I love Jeffrey's point about, it's global trade in a global world. Well, the US used to think it could be isolationist. The US used to think, hey, we can do this on our own. We're one of the biggest oil producers now. We can, we've got our own energy strategy. And I think what the surprise has probably been that actually with the war in the Ukraine, prices are up everywhere. Everyone has to deal with the energy security question. And the easy option in the States is probably saying, well, actually, we've got oil, so let's try to do that. But the price of oil being, now that they're sensitive to it, that's no longer an option. And so I think probably, perhaps someone in favor of renewables and energy transition. The good thing is it forces everyone to think about what the next steps are and what the strategy is, whether it's to bring on hydrogen, which I know there are so many proponents of here on this call, but also other renewable forms, that localized anaerobic digestion, offshore wind, onshore wind, even biomass as a transition energy, all these other things are good alternatives. And I think now is a time more than ever for the US to focus on, that strategy and implementing it as much as Europe. So we talk about the EU position and how we are now, really having to think about it, put in place new strategies, move them to implementation, find that special magic to get that final investment decision to move things forward. But the US is having to go through those same decisions. I think the only benefit is perhaps a little bit more diversification in the starting position in the US relative to some of the countries in Europe, and probably the advantage of having a larger nuclear fleet would probably be my point for the US. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Thanks a lot, Victoria, and thanks a lot to you all. Very interesting points there. So I think one of the takeaways is that we have to take what we can do within our member states, within Europe, also strengthen and build on the assets that we have already here to produce cleaner and more energy on European ground, but also while keeping the dialogue open. We need to keep those trade dialogues open, and we'll need to diversify our trading partners. This is what the REPowerEU strategy aims to do. So we need to keep on doing this further, and the US obviously is a key stakeholder in the equation too. So I'll stop here and maybe just finish by saying that we need a clear regulatory framework also for the EU for the clean hydrogen economy, but for the clean renewables economy that we want also in general, in order to achieve these goals. So I'll leave it here, and thanks a lot to you all, Victoria, Jeffrey, and Amer, for having joined us on this interesting panel on the energy security, looking at the European case. And I'll hand over to you, Solomon and Ahmed.
Thank you so much. This was a real interesting discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope we can do more of it. Thank you so much. It was really thought-provoking discussion. I look forward to I'm going to hear it again, to listen to it again, and I will probably get some questions from the audience that will forward to you. Thank you so much for spending the time and volunteering your time here. Thanks.
Thank you.
And we'll move to next panel. I hope you stay with us and listen to some of the other things we are going to discuss. There is another panel later on that it may fit with what you're talking about, except it is not regarding Europe. It's more general about the role of petroleum in this whole discussion. Thank you so much for your time.